If you're here to listen to our presentation on leveraging disability education. Become familiar with leveraging disability education law and health programs. I'd like to introduce Tara Muller.
Thank you, Jim. Good morning, everyone. My name is Tara Muller. I'm an attorney at Disability Rights North Carolina. And I would like to introduce also Rayla Collins, who is an attorney on our education team at Disability Rights North Carolina. She works with children with disabilities, helping them stay in the school system and in the integrated classroom. We are really happy to be here today to discuss the overlap of children who experience trauma, have high ACEs scores that we heard about this morning, and those with disabilities. I'll give you a little roadmap of where we intend to go today so that you have some guidelines. First, we're going to start with generally how the incidents of trauma correspond with disability and vice versa, how children who are born with disabilities also are at an increased risk of experiencing trauma. And next, how you all, as you're working with children, can leverage the laws that are already in place to help those children. So there are two primary tools that we will be discussing. One is the health system through Medicaid and other health benefits for children in North Carolina with disabilities. And then also the education system that already has built into it a lot of protections, both federal and state laws to protect children with disabilities and get them connected to the help they need. And then finally, I'll discuss our role at Disability Rights North Carolina and how we help children, and also how we help advocates like you and people who work with children getting questions and advice and resources. First, I'll discuss child trauma and its link to disability. We know from lots and lots of studies and statistics that children with disabilities are more likely to experience trauma, especially sexual abuse. And the National Institutes of Health have lots of data on this point. They tend to be more vulnerable. They tend to be less connected to resources to report. And then also sometimes they have barriers to communicating and reporting incidents of things like abuse. Also, people with high ACEs scores are often diagnosed with a disability that they may not have had until they experienced the trauma, right? So we heard this morning about the incidence of mental illness, things like post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, anxiety, certain phobias. All that, of course, comes along often following traumatic events in a child's life. We know that 36% of people with disabilities reported high ACEs scores, and that's compared to 19% of the non-disabled population. So it is a significant difference. And then on top of that, not only are children with disabilities more vulnerable to abuse and neglect and other types of high ACE scores that we've talked about, but also once they do experience that trauma, they tend to be less resilient. And so especially without the additional supports that can help them through these disabilities. So what we wanted to express to you today is to make sure that when you are working with youth and encountering them in your work, that you look for a possible disability link, because that can open a lot of doors for a lot of children who otherwise are not connected to resources. And opening those doors can help them stay in school, stay out of the justice system, stay out of congregate living that we know also is linked to additional trauma. And then we also wanted to remind you that there are a lot of disabilities that are not readily apparent. We've talked about, some of the ones that manifest in ways that are very obvious, but also we have the invisible disabilities that are often overlooked. The fetal alcohol syndrome disorder is really pervasive and often misdiagnosed as, something else, ADHD, or something else that is, and once it's misdiagnosed, it cannot, it's not treated correctly. So FASD, which is the fetal alcohol syndrome disorder. We have traumatic brain injury, anxiety, phobias. All of those conditions often are overlooked. So our goal is, as we discussed, is diversion from the justice system and other institutional settings. We know that certain experiences in a child's life can themselves create trauma in children, even if the systems are meant to help. And that's what we see a lot in the medical system, for example. When children are brought into certain types of institutional care, when it is a locked facility, when it is overly restrictive for their needs, when they are kept in a certain environment longer than they need to be, all of that can be very traumatic and can cause additional problems, especially when the child already has a high trauma history. There are lots of studies I can point you to, and I'm happy to give out these slides afterwards if anyone would like. And this presentation links some of those studies, linking early institutionalization of children to post-institutional syndrome and other mental illness and disabilities that could be avoided if the child got the correct treatment in a community-based setting. So some of the common situations we see here in North Carolina of unnecessary institutionalization is involuntary commitment and extended emergency room boarding. You all probably have heard scenarios where children get admitted into the emergency room for something like self-harm or for incidents of violence. And then because of lack of community resources, lack of health access in the community and in the home environment, they're unable to be placed in a correct environment in the community. And so they end up staying for much, much longer than they should. And we see that also in our psychiatric residential treatment facilities, which are institutions for children that often, again, do not provide evidence-based care and are overly restrictive and keep children much, much longer than they should be, in some cases, even up to 2 or 3 years. So our best informed practices are to identify possible disabilities and services to help with things like keeping kids in school, strengthening kinship supports and foster placements. And kinship supports are especially important. That's, identifying a child when they're having, situations at home where the parent is no longer able to meet their needs, looking for extended relatives, cousins, aunts, uncles, grandparents. The data is really strong to suggest that those kinship supports provide a solid basis for those kids as compared to, the state DSS custody. Strengthening the health resources, making sure people in the family are connected to health resources. Again, we are very pleased about Medicaid expansion in many ways to connect the families to those health resources. We often see families broken up over inability of family members to access health resources. So we are hopeful that with the additional Medicaid expansion, we'll see some improvements there. Complying with laws governing seclusion and restraint is important, and we work hard at our organization to make sure that seclusion and restraint, when it is used appropriately to meet the needs of the child's disability. That should always be a concept that is considered along with any type of seclusion or restraint. And then reducing the likelihood of labeling, bullying, accusing a child of possible violence or behavior problems. We find that once the child is diagnosed with a disability, it is easier to connect them to resources rather than to do these other things that will increase trauma. So next, I'd like to discuss the Medicaid's role. And this is important because Medicaid, offers a lot of connections to resources, not just for the child, but for the whole family. And that is so important, as we've heard all day today. The connection to family, the strength of the family unit is just so important to children. Medicaid is for low income families, but also for children with disabilities. And we find that Medicaid, as opposed to private insurance, often provides a lot of services that are not provided in private insurance. So a lot of community-based care, a lot of in-home services, for example, that may or may not be covered in private insurance. So it is always an option to look into the availability of Medicaid. So EPSDT, which is the early parental screening and detection, is what we call the children's Medicaid, and that's what most people under Medicaid, when they're under 21, use for their services. It is designed to cover all medically necessary treatment. It does have some exclusions, and it does have, the exclusions tend to be ones that you would assume, right? So if it's unsafe, if it's ineffective, if it's somehow experimental, but there are supposed to be no limits on how much or how long children get services. And so it's important to understand children's rights under Medicaid, that if they are Medicaid eligible, if they are receiving services, they do have rights. Their family has rights to appeal any denial, to look into options if services are needed but are not being received. Especially in this climate right now that we have in North Carolina with the shortage of healthcare providers. We hear a lot of families who say, I was approved for services, my child was approved for services, but they say there is nothing available in my community, or they say I have to wait 6 months for an appointment, or they say my needs are too demanding. I'm not because my child has had violent incidents in the past, this so-and-so provider is not appropriate. All of those types of issues are the issues that we help with at Disability Rights North Carolina, making sure that children do get access to the services to which they are legally entitled. So I just wanted to emphasize how important it is, not just to take, to make sure to advocate for the child, to make sure the child's family is advocating for the child, and that, no is not an answer, right? If a child is denied certain services that are medically required, that child should be getting the services, and there is a way to advocate for them. We are really, really excited that next year, the North Carolina will be launching the Children and Family Specialty Plan under Medicaid. If you all have not heard of this, I'll give you a little background. This used to be called the Foster Plan when it was first designed. It's now called Children and Family, CAF is what DHHS calls it now. The Children and Family Specialty Plan is so exciting because it will cover all children who are currently in the foster program. So they have been in the custody of DSS or have been in the past. And it also covers their families. So that's why we are excited, because so many of the parents themselves need medical treatment for example, substance use disorder or severe and persistent mental illness. When those family units get the health access that they need, that trickles down and, of course, keeps the family together and helps the child with the disability as well. So the Children and Family Specialty Plan is scheduled to go live next December. So it sounds like a long way away. It's a little over a year, but we are really excited. The Department of Health and Human Services worked for years developing this program. They worked with the input of lots of stakeholders. Another big strength of the program is that it is statewide. So any of you who work with children in the foster system know that they bounce around a whole lot more than they should, a whole lot more than anybody in the system would like. from placement to placement all over the state. And a big barrier up until now has been that every time they pick up and move, not only do they have to get used to a new family and a new housing situation and a new school, but also new medical providers. And this statewide system is so important to these children because it does provide that continuity, having the same case manager and care coordinator overseeing the child, going with them to the schools and the appointments is so important. So just a flag to look out for that and to make sure that as you're working with children who are connected to the foster system, that they do get connected to those resources. And if anybody has any questions as I'm going along, I would be happy to answer any questions or comments or hear from you. I know a lot of you all in the audience probably work directly with children and may have experiences or information to share. So by all means, please feel free to raise your hand if there's anything we can. Yes, go ahead. The question is about this type of services that we offer at DRNC. And I know I've probably used too many acronyms here today. So I am from a group called Disability Rights North Carolina. We are the state's federally mandated protection and advocacy organization for the state. So we provide statewide legal advice and services to people with disabilities. We are not connected with or affiliated with DHHS, which is the Department of Health and Human Services. They are the ones that oversee the Medicaid system in our state. And they are the ones who oversee the managed care organizations that you mentioned, like VIA, Alliance, Trillium. And so to the extent, but we do work very closely with them. A lot of our attorneys that represent children with disabilities can help the children and the families connect with the resources they need at the LMEMs. We call them LMEMCOs, the local managed entities and managed care organizations that manage children's behavioral health and the rest of the Medicaid system, right? Because we know there are a lot of barriers. It's difficult. It's a huge system. It's complicated. So yes, we provide those services, and we also have a lot of resources on our website, but we are not affiliated with DHHS at all. To answer your question. Hopefully that answers your question. The Child and Family Specialty Plan is the biological family and the foster family. Yes. So it should be, and there are some, it's very complicated and there are a lot of exceptions and guidelines, but yes, it should cover the entire family at risk of losing custody. Yes. And there's also, I didn't mention the tailored plan. The tailored plan should be rolling out soon. That's a specialty plan as well, that will be meeting the needs of children with not just children, adults and children with mental illness, intellectual and developmental disabilities, substance use disorder. That's another specialized plan that will provide care management. And actually the care management piece has already rolled out. So if you have children that fall into that category, they should already be receiving the tailored care management, which is another tool that helps them navigate the medical system and helps with not just medical care, but other social determinants of health, like transportation and housing access. Affordable, accessible housing is a huge barrier to a lot of these families as well. So if you do encounter children that fall in that category, I would advise you to ask if they have a tailored care manager yet, and if their tailored care manager can help them connect to resources. So we discussed the importance of, finding if the child has a disability first. Once we know the child has a disability, then we can connect them to resources like Medicaid. And then I talked to you about Medicaid, but I didn't talk to you about the specialty plans within Medicaid that often help provide services. First of all, some of them are not income-based, so they can allow people who would not otherwise be eligible for Medicaid to get services. The innovations waiver is one of those. The innovations waiver is for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And there's a really long wait list right now. And that's unfortunate because the innovations waiver provides services to help people stay out of institutions. And we already talked about just how important it is to, stay in the community and how traumatizing it can be to enter an institution when your needs do not require it. There's also 1915I services that rolled out just a few months ago. Those also provide services for families who want their children to stay in the community, and CAP-C, which is for children with complex needs. So the reason this is important, again, is it's reduces the likelihood of exposing the child to additional trauma like seclusion and restraint. And it can also help connect the child to school resources, which we will be getting into in just a moment. So before we go on to the public schools role, I wanted to make sure nobody has any more questions about Medicaid's role and how connecting a child with disability in that space can be leveraged. Okay, then I will go into the public schools role. So there's another huge advantage to finding out if the child has a disability. And that is all the resources in the school system. So a disability as a definition under federal and state law is much, much broader than you would probably think. So a lot of people think of disability only in limited capacities. And it's important when you're working with children to remember that a disability can be, well, we know it can be invisible, right? Mental and psychological, but it can also be something that we don't usually think of, like behavioral in nature, manifesting in behavioral symptoms. So I'll read to you the definition. It is a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. Or if you have a history of that type of disability, or if you are perceived as having that type of disability. So all of that would entitle you to the rights that come with having a disability under federal and state law. So in our context here, as we are discussing children with a history of trauma, that would include something like a serious emotional disability, what we call an SED. And those are the children that we've been, that we talk about, that we've been talking about, that, the ones that get into trouble at school, right? The ones who are more likely to be suspended, the ones whose parents get frustrated and may be more likely to be subjected to abuse, right? So remember that SED, serious emotional disability, is another option, along with anxiety, PTSD, depression, the invisible disabilities, the FASD that I mentioned earlier. And that's where the importance of school-based evaluations come in. So Rayla and her team at Disability Rights North Carolina work with families who are in public school and who are working to stay in public school. So a lot of the problems that we see come when a child is excluded from school because of a disability, whether or not the school or the child or the parent is aware at the beginning that the behavior is associated with a disability. So we also work on making sure that school staff is trauma informed, and when they are helping with behavior and other issues in the classroom, they remain focused on the child's needs with respect to their disability. Also, we work on prevention and early identification of trauma and the preventable environmental triggers. So a lot of children, like we talked earlier about, certain children needing small accommodations that would allow them to learn alongside non-disabled peers in the classroom, right? Earmuffs or certain devices, for example. There is a parent's guide. And again, I'd be happy to give you this link that Duke Law puts out that helps parents with navigate the system of an IEP, which is an individualized education plan and a behavior intervention plan. All of those are tools that are used to help children stay in the school system and get the education to which they are entitled. And it's a complicated process. Rayla and her team work really hard to help families appeal and work with the school systems and the exceptional children's departments to make sure that the needs are being met and all the laws are being complied with. So this is the federal law that sets the continuum of services in the school system. So you can think of this as kind of a stepping stone up, a set of steps. And every state is required to have this continuum in their public school system. So the bottom step, the step that is the default, so that is, what every child is entitled to. Every child with a disability is a full-time education with peers who are not disabled. So we're talking about a child getting to stay in the regular classroom with non-disabled peers. Any removal from that general environment must be justified. And that justification will then lead to them going to the next step, and then the next step, and the next step. But what's important to know is that it's not allowed, you're not allowed to just jump steps. So you try the steps and you see what works within the individualized education plan. And it's important because a lot of schools and school systems, especially now that so many of them are short-staffed and may not have the resources to accommodate a child's disability, especially the really challenging disabilities, might not offer or might not have available some of these steps. So the next step is the pull-out classroom. And then the next one after that is a self-contained classroom. The next one is the specialty school, and the special schools are separate public or private programs that are day schools that are designed to meet the needs of children with disabilities. We all know there is a huge shortage of these in North Carolina, and unfortunately that sets North Carolina apart from a lot of our other states. Many other states have really robust specialty schools to send children to. We have at Disability Rights have been advocating really hard to increase the ability of these schools to run in North Carolina. And we hope to get some momentum on that and change legislatively next session. But for the time being, we do have, a lot of barriers to the use of these specialty schools. But it's important to note that students are entitled to these less restrictive environments before they get to the next step. And unfortunately, what we see is a lot of kids jumping right to that next step, unfortunately, which is homebound. They call it modified day, or long-term suspension, which is at least 10 days, more than 10 school days. And that's important because, that triggers the reason that Rayla corrected me is it's more than 10 days because that's important because legally it triggers a lot of rights for the child once you get more than 10 days. And again, we do provide some one-on-one assistance with families, but we also have a whole lot of resources on our website at disabilityrightsnc.org that have sample letters to send to schools, sample guidelines on, or, to-do lists and guidelines on how to help with an IEP when that it's not being met. So if a child, it's kind of it's a big red flag. If a child has been subjected to suspension, especially long-term suspension on multiple occasions, or they are placed on homebound or modified day, and by that, I mean, some of them say you can only come to school in the mornings and then you're supposed to get your education at home the rest of the day, or a certain number of hours a day. So when you see that, it should be a red flag to you that the child may be entitled to some services they're not receiving. And then the last step is the residential schools. Oh, we have a question.
I was just saying that's like all of the clients we serve is kids who've been excluded from school, and then because of that, or because of a similar incident, end up involved in the juvenile justice system. And as a court counselor, I think one thing that is helpful is having some resources to provide to the families about what they are entitled to in school, like knowing where to point them about what they're entitled to in school, and what some of their dispute resolution options are and appeal rights are for when their kid's not receiving those services in school. There's a lot of dispute resolution options available for parents that they often don't know about. And so we like pointing them to our website. We have so many materials geared towards exactly those families. And then also, just as a plug, as a juvenile court counselor, we see a lot of kids who get involved in the juvenile justice system and then receive diversion plans to divert them out of the system, it's a good idea, but there's often terms in those plans that they can't meet because of their disability, because they're then just stuck back in the school system with still no resources. And they're expected to like not get in trouble and make good grades and attend school. But nothing in the school system has changed to help them meet those terms. And so then they end up right back in the system. So just thinking of it as something that all works and ties together, and thinking of it as if this kid continues to not get the services they're entitled to in school, they're not going to be able to meet those terms, change their behavior, and stay diverted from the juvenile justice system. So point the families to resources, our website, and the parents guide that Tara mentioned and will share, and just like really work on the school piece, help the families understand why that is so important in keeping their kid out of the juvenile justice system.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Yeah, so there's a lot of discipline protections for children with disabilities, specifically for kids who are suspended a lot. And that's actually what's on this slide is, so when a child with a disability receives more than 10 days of out of school suspension in one school year, so that can be one long-term suspension or a lot of short-term suspensions that add up to more than 10 days, including like what we call informal suspensions, where the school calls and is like, they're having a hard day, can you come pick them up? They're not suspended. That counts. That's a real suspension. It's a suspension, whether or not they call it that. All of those count up towards 10 days. And when they get to more than 10 days, they have a right to a manifestation determination review meeting. So that's like a special meeting of the IEP team where they meet to determine if the behavior that was resulting in this exclusion was a manifestation of the child's disability or the school's failure to follow the IEP. And if the answer to either of those questions is yes, the kid can't be suspended. They have to be allowed to come back to school, and they have to be allowed to come back to school in the setting where they were prior to the suspension. And all that is to say, kids who are in the process of being evaluated for an IEP, or if the school, if there's like a suspicion that the child has an IEP, even if they haven't started the official evaluation process, they're still entitled to that MDR right. So if they're in the 90 days, if they're being suspended and it gets to more than 10 days, then they need to do an MDR, whether or not they've completed the evaluations and determined whether or not the child's eligible and created the IEP. They still have that right. Yeah.
Thank you. Any more questions before we go to the next slide? Okay. And
Sorry. So if the MDR finds out that there's an issue with the IEP not being made, they're like a suspension, not to be eraser.
Unfortunately not. You can't like they still happened. The kid was still excluded. And so all of the things that result when a kid's excluded from school have still happened to that child. But it's actually beneficial for them to not be erased, in the sense that after they hit that 10 days, every single time there is a school exclusion after that, they have to do a new MDR. So the 10 days doesn't start over. The next week, if they're suspended one more day, you have to do a new MDR. And then, I mean, sometimes schools do that, but sometimes it gets so annoying to them that they're like, I would rather not have a meeting every week, and I should maybe start addressing the actual behaviors that are happening in school. And then also when an MDR is positive, which means it was related to the child's disability or the school's failure to implement the IEP, then if the kid doesn't already have a behavior intervention plan, the school has to conduct what we call a functional behavioral assessment, which is an evaluation to kind of try to determine what the function of the behavior is, what's happening for the kid, why are they having these behaviors, and develop a behavior intervention plan. So if there's been a positive MDR, the kid is entitled to an FBA and a BIP. You don't have to get to an MDR. We always argue that you proactively ask for a behavior intervention plan if a kid has challenging behaviors in school, even if they're not getting suspended or the suspensions haven't added up to 10 days. But when you have a positive MDR, it's a must. That the school conduct that evaluation and develop it. And if the kid already has a behavior intervention plan, then that team needs to review it after a positive MDR, because clearly it's not working if the kid's still getting suspended. So the idea is that they come back to the table and figure out what additional behavior supports need to be put in place to try to prevent future suspensions. Yeah.
Thank you. Those are all great questions. So I think Rayla has pretty much covered the IEP process and the referral. The referral can come from so many different people. I listed them here, and there's a lot of information on our website, again, about how to start the referral process. If you think that there's a child with a disability whose needs are not being met, there are some sample letters on our website that will help, that you can use as templates. And we discussed the 90 calendar days and the school's obligation to evaluate the child. We also wanted to mention that, we recommend the best practice when dealing with the child, when discussing the IEP with the school, is to cooperate by attending the meetings, making sure that these schools are often, understaffed and really working hard to accommodate. And it is important to stay engaged through the process and to work with the school to schedule it and to attend the meetings when they are scheduled. We also recommend communicating in writing. It's not required, but it's always best to keep a paper trail, even if it's email, with the teachers, especially when we're dealing with something like Rayla mentioned earlier, which is the informal suspensions, right? Like coming to pick my child up early, or, situations like that should be documented so that down the road, you've got evidence of what happened and what's been going on. We discussed the options already if the IEP is not followed. So we recommend remaining respectful with the school, and that's not always easy, right? We're talking about your own child or your own foster child or your own, family member, and tensions can get high. So it's important to keep a level head. There is a Tale of Two Conversations videos on our website that is linked in this slideshow as well, that are really helpful to show, just how productive a meeting can be when everyone is cooperating and speaking the same language. There's also the right to engage a trained facilitator, which we briefly discussed earlier, and the right to request compensatory education. So if it turns out that the child's IEP did entitle the child to some services, but the child did not get those services for a certain amount of time, the child is allowed to ask for compensation, which is compensatory, back due services. So like if, for example, if a child is entitled to speech therapy, but the school says, oh, well, for a few months, there's no speech therapist because she's on maternity leave or sick, or, we don't have one in the district, or for whatever reason, school's not able to provide the services, then that child could request compensatory therapy. And then the next step is, if the dispute rises to the level of needing a formal written complaint, we've got examples of complaints on our website that families can use to complain that an IEP is not being followed. Or then the next step after that is a petition, which is a more formal step.
Can I say something briefly? Another common situation that we see for services not being provided and entitling a kid to compensatory education is at the beginning of the school year. We hear a lot of two things, which is, oh, we're just not ready for them yet. We're getting the classroom ready, or we're still trying to find a teacher. So you just hang out at home until we figured it out. We hear this all the time. And another one is the school not having any transportation. The kid, for whatever reason, needing some type of special transportation service, maybe an additional person on the bus or some sort of, physical accommodation on the bus, and the school not having access to that at the beginning of the year. So the kid not having any way to get to school. So delays in starting the school year is really common, and the kid is entitled to compensatory education for that entire time because they're entitled to be at school, and it's not their fault that the school is not ready for them. So
I think we discussed some of how underutilized the IEP process is and how, how helpful it can be once a child is diagnosed. There's also a 504 plan that is less formal than the IEP, but also can travel with the child after high school. And then there's the behavior intervention plan that we discussed earlier. I thought you'd be interested to know just how many students we're talking about. On any given day, we have approximately 800 students in North Carolina that are on homebound instruction and 300 that are on shortened day. It may be even higher than that. And in many cases, at least, those students are in those situations because the students are not getting the services to which they are entitled. So it is important to make sure to advocate for those families. So I think the overriding theme is that there is a really high cost to these children when their needs are not met, when they have high trauma histories and they have disability related needs and those needs are not met. So a lot of times the parents are forced to pay out of pocket for services that they shouldn't have to pay out of pocket for. And of course, that would affect the families with the lowest resources who cannot afford to pay out of pocket. We also see parents a lot who are forced to leave the workforce to care for a child, especially when a child is placed on modified day or long-term suspension and has nowhere to go but home. We have children stranded in inappropriate settings, like we discussed, the emergency rooms and in institutions, and of course, involvement in the justice system and detention facilities. It's costly too. The cost of institutional care is approximately $2,300 a day. And we have students in North Carolina who, because of their unmet disability needs, are being sent even to out-of-state facilities and very restrictive environments here in North Carolina, 700 approximately per year. So we work hard to make sure that those types of unnecessary situations can be avoided when the disability needs are met. Next, I'd like to discuss, we just have a few minutes left, and I'd like to discuss a little about our organization, Disability Rights North Carolina. We are a statewide nonprofit. We are federally mandated. So every state is required to have a protection and advocacy organization like ours to protect the rights of both children and adults with disabilities. All of our services are free and we work statewide. We don't have any income limitations on who we help. We help people with disabilities and all types of disabilities, all ages. We started back in the 1970s when a reporter named Geraldo Rivera, who is a talk show host, made a surprise visit to a facility in New York called Willowbrook. That was a institution for adult men with intellectual disabilities. And he jumped the fence and with live cameras on live TV exposed the horrific conditions and trauma that was going on in that facility. And as a result, Congress created this protection and advocacy system that we belong to and that guides our work. So our responsibility in North Carolina is to make sure that people with disabilities are living in safe and humane conditions. A lot of our focus is on unnecessary institutionalization. So we work hard. We do have a monitoring department that goes all across the state, monitoring and investigating in facilities where people get services. So in congregate living facilities, in hospitals, even in locked facilities, we are allowed to go in and investigate and monitor the conditions and to make sure that people are not in there unnecessarily. We work to enforce all of the federal and state laws, and we also participate in a lot of outreach events and coalition work to make sure that people understand their legal rights. A lot of our work involves enforcing this law called Olmstead. Olmstead is the law that says that everybody with a disability is entitled to live in the least restrictive environment, to live, work, and play. So to live, work, and play, to basically experience life in the least restrictive environment that suits their needs. And so a lot of our work involves making sure that people do not have to enter into a, say, hospital or nursing home or psych hospital or residential facility only because there are not resources in the community. So because of the Olmstead Law, states are now required to provide home and community-based services in the least restrictive environment. And so a lot of our work involves making sure that the current policies statewide, both the laws and the policies and the actual implementation of those policies is legal. Again, we help a wide range of people with disabilities, and we also provide technical assistance. So that's something I wanted to mention to you all. We are always available. Like I said, the first stop should always be our website because we have such really rich resources in all kinds of legal areas, disabilityrightsnc.org. But if you're not able to find the resources you need on our website, we also have an intake line and a website form for intake that takes a little longer to get a response, but we will connect you to resources or provide one-on-one advice depending on the scenario. We do have a no wrong door approach. So if we're not able to help, our work is guided by some targets that are set by people with disabilities. So we must stay within those targets when we do our work. And so sometimes if a request falls outside the target, we'll have to direct you to other organizations, but we do always try to do at least a warm handoff so that the person gets the resources they need. Again, we do information and referrals, self-advocacy assistance, public policy influence, which is my job, working at the legislature. And then we also have a rich supply of research and reports that we do. And finally, there's the information on how to contact us. I should have mentioned, we also have we've added a call line only specifically for abuse and neglect in facilities. So when you call our main number, you will be given the choice to get a much more immediate response if there is allegations of abuse or neglect in a facility. But we also have these toll-free numbers, and we are fully accessible, both Spanish and English, and we accommodate all the disabilities. Thank you. And we are a nonprofit, so we appreciate anyone supporting our work.